on. Go live.
Hey guys, welcome to Dusty Wheel. Appreciate you showing up for this little special event. Drew McCaffrey and I have been talking about doing this for a while now. And so, yeah, I'm really excited to actually talk all about Inking Out Loud. It's a podcast that Drew actually co-hosts. Began earlier in February, I think, of this year. Drew is actually a contributing writer on Tor.com. He's a frequent panelist at Jordan.com. And, that's what makes it so exciting to have him here with us. So, without further ado, why don't we bring Drew come on in and let's get started. I'm excited to kind of talk about the podcast with you. Welcome, Drew. Good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Matt.
Absolutely. So why don't we just get started? And I don't know if any of our viewers or know much about the Inking Out Loud podcast itself. Why did you guys make this podcast? What are you looking to do?
Well, there's kind of a twofold purpose to it. One, we really want to just discuss some of the books that we love the most.
Sure.
And part of that is that some of my favorite books, some of my co-host Rob's favorite books are lesser known. There are a lot of science fiction, fantasy, book review podcasts, book club kind of podcasts out there now.
For sure.
But many of the most prominent ones pretty much concentrate on the same few series: The Wheel of Time, A Song of Ice and Fire, Mistborn, Stormlight Archive, things like that, Tolkien. And we wanted to kind of give a voice to some of these, maybe lesser known classics and cult classics. So,
okay.
While we do touch on, some Brandon Sanderson and we're in the middle of a Wheel of Time read through, we try to give a big focus, to these series that we think fans of Sanderson and Jordan and Martin would love, but probably wouldn't hear just in their regular forums.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now
Rob.
And then the other... Rob is your co-host. What can you tell us about him?
Yes. Rob Santos. So yeah, he's up in Canada. He's an Ontario native, and he unfortunately works quite a lot on weekends. So he's not super accessible, but he's a huge Wheel of Time fan, Cosmere fan. He and I co-founded the Cosmere Theories Facebook group, and he really knows his stuff. He's a well-read guy, and it's a joy to be able to kind of discuss books weekly with him.
Sure. Remind me, how did you meet Rob?
I actually met him through Facebook.
Okay.
Kind of a crazy story. If you want to get the full story on that, our very first Eye of the World episode on Inking Out Loud, Rob kind of broke it down. We connected because he saw a picture where I was dressed up as Ellen Venture from Mistborn, and he ended up shooting me a friend request, and I thought he was somebody he wasn't. I thought he was my old backdoor neighbor, but it turns out it was a totally different Rob Santos.
Nice.
But the rest is history. I mean, he's become one of my best friends, and we're having a blast doing Inking Out Loud.
Yeah, and that's how Drew and I actually met at JordanCon. And I think we were talking before the show, it was 4 years now. And that's why one of the reasons why I definitely wanted to have you on here at the Dusty Wheel. Beyond the fact that Inking Out Loud is touching on a lot of different series out there, you guys you're starting through. I think you're in Shadow Rising right now. Is that where you're at in your reread with Wheel of Time? Yeah.
So we're going to be recording the second part of the Shadow Rising tomorrow. Our first Dragon Reborn episode will be going live tomorrow.
Oh yeah, I want to hear that one. I think you're covering a topic in there. Is that the one? If I'm not mistaken, you're covering parallel dimensions in that one, right?
It is, and I have to admit right now, I got something slightly wrong in my explanation of parallel and perpendicular worlds that I'm going to have to rectify on one of our Shadow Rising episodes coming up here.
Yeah, you're gonna. I guess you can kind of retcon it, right? You can be like, okay, back then I want to change what I said. You should be able to go back.
Exactly,
You should. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just gonna say it's a time-honored tradition in the Wheel of Time. Robert Jordan did this plenty of times.
Right. Oh, I mean, just pause for a second. Hey guys, remember, as we do eventually kind of get into deeper Wheel of Time discussions later on in this call, there will be spoilers. We'll try to throw up a little spoiler warning at the bottom of the screen. And remember, this is a live call-in talk show. Drew was grateful enough to enable us to do that today for this special event too. And so he's happy to take your live calls. If something comes up, you want to ask Drew a call, you want to ask me a call, or you just want to make a general comment, please do that. And you'll see that number at the bottom of the screen also. For those of you that eventually are listening to this, it won't really matter at that point because the live call-in number will not be available. But it is 1313 talk watt, 1313 talk watt. I believe that's 825-5968. And so, yeah, feel free to give us a call when we see you. We might drop you in, and you can ask Drew a question. But let's get back to what the Inking Out Loud podcast. Is there a favorite book? I mean, obviously, I know you love The Wheel of Time, but I think The Wheel of Time, you said, it started with your 29th episode. So before that, is there something that in doing the podcast and in talking about it that you you gained another favorite, or were these just books that you've just always loved that you covered?
So this is kind of the other side of what we're going for, and that is we want to approach our discussion of books with a little more of like a writing perspective, because both Rob and I are writers, and and going back and reading some of my old favorite books, and stuff I haven't read since I was 13, 14, 15, or even things that I've read more recently but didn't consider from a writer's perspective. I have found new books that I love and that really stand out to me that we've covered so far. One of them is brand new this year. It just came out in March. It's called A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martine. And I think it is one of the most beautifully written books I've read in years. It's a space opera. It deals with a lot of themes about colonization and cultural hegemony, and also treats like a narrative and language as cultural touchstones in ways that I really haven't seen before in a science fiction book, and I loved it. But then the other one, which amusingly was a totally different kind of book, and really it's a 4-book series, is The Acts of Cain by Matthew Woodring Stover. It's an old school. The first book is called Heroes Die, and it came out in 1996 or 1998, I think. And it's grimdark science fiction fantasy written about 10 years before grimdark really became a thing. So he was really ahead of his time. And because of that, he's, nobody knows about this guy. If people have heard about him, normally it's through his Star Wars Expanded Universe stuff, because he did the Revenge of the Sith novelization, which, by the way, brilliant book. You wouldn't think it considering the story in Revenge of the Sith, but man, did he knock that one out of the park. And he also did the big Mace Windu book called Shatterpoint and a few others. But yeah, so The Acts of Cain is pretty unknown, relatively speaking, but I have yet to read a grimdark fantasy that's better. I mean, it's truly outstanding.
That's a resounding recommendation there. So what we'll do is, I think after the show, we'll drop both those recommendations in the about section of this podcast. So anyone that's watching, if you haven't tracked those, you can follow those. Those sound really interesting. I would tell you that I am absolutely going to read those books, but these days, as a good friend of mine says, he's like, you tell people you're a reader. That used to be the truth. I was like, ouch, man. But this is what's getting me back into it, right? Like just talking with my friends about it. It does make me want to get back in my chair and just down a good book. Although with the Wheel of Time TV series coming out, it's about time that I just need to get back to that series. And when we talk about that, how did you get into the Wheel of Time? Like, how old were you when you started the books?
Ooh, I was 11 years old, just about to turn 12, and I had been kind of just submerged in the Star Wars Expanded Universe. And my parents were not thrilled about that. They wanted me to read something new. and had been trying to get me to read things and trying and failing. And finally it was right after the, From the Two Rivers and To the Blight young adult split of Eye of the World came out.
Interesting. Okay.
They tossed those in my lap and said, "Hey, you're reading this." And I was reluctant. I mean, it took me almost a month to get to Winter Night.
Wow.
But man, when I hit Winter Night, it was game over.
So this is interesting. That worked. Just chucking the book in your lap worked. Like I have a couple kids, and that has not worked. That has not worked for me. I don't know if it's just they've just been overwhelmed by how much Wheel of Time is in their lives that they're just like, I want to do something else. But yeah, I can't say I have one of my daughters has read The Eye of the World, and she thought I think she generally thought it was a good book. But then I handed her like The Great Hunt, which for me, that's where this. I mean, don't get me wrong, I liked The Eye of the World, but The Great Hunt is where it really expanded for my mind. That's where I really got into it, and for her, it's just been like she's like, well, I want to go back to what I was doing before you suggested to me. I think I might have said, you can come to JordanCon if you read The Eye of the World. So, I don't know how much genuine love there was for her to get through the book. She got through it. And that's the furthest anyone in my family, other than myself, has gotten in the Wheel of Time. So it's good to hear that does work, just chucking a book. And maybe like they gave you the split version. Maybe that would be a great way to get them started. I like that idea. That's pretty funny. Well, how did you now? I don't know if all of our viewers at this point, when they see this video, those who are watching us live know this. Drew, I would say, is someone when it comes to Wheel of Time knowledge. This is not to make you blush or anything, Drew, but I count him in kind of the top 5 people when it comes to experts, just general experts where I can count on asking pretty much any question. And I think you'll likely have the answer or you'll have a good idea of what that is. Now, look, there's very few people that are that well read. Is it because you've read the series 30 times? Is it just you like Wheel of Time facts themselves? Why do you think that, when I go to JordanCon, or you've won so many of the trivia competitions, like why is that a thing for you? Did I embarrass you enough there?
Yeah, it is in large part because, my formative years as a fantasy reader were so utterly consumed with the Wheel of Time. I have read most of these books upwards of 30 or 35 times. But it goes beyond that too. I mean, it's easy to read books many times and not retain the information. But a big part of it for me was my activity in the Wheel of Time fandom. It was Watmania and Dragonmount and then Raffo after Watmania went defunct, and then the Facebook groups, and it was the constant theorizing and the constant need to be up to date on what Robert Jordan said. And I mean, I'll tell you right now, I've used Theoryland's interview database countless times. When I'm talking theories and just checking up on random facts, and I'm like, oh, I thought something there, and then I check it and I'm like, oh, okay, I was wrong or I was right, or whatever. And so it's mostly just a complete submersion in the Wheel of Time is how just the trivia sticks.
Yeah, it's a weird thing. I find myself a little bit too often when I'm listening to other people talk about the Wheel of Time, I'm thinking too much about correcting things. It almost has taken some of the fun of that part of it away from me, because I might hear something like, this is a really interesting conversation, and all of a sudden I want to write them like, no, what you just said is actually, you didn't read this answer in the database. And I get a little bit like, no, I don't have to be the fact guy all the time, but it's certainly in my head to kind of say like, oh man, no, like that's, and I have to kind of pull back from that a little bit. But yeah, that interview database is just a product of which, by the way, Therese, mostly responsible for kind of keeping that thing up to date. So many and much thanks to her. But that thing is always just meant for like, hey, search it out here so we can like talk about the awesomeness of the fact that Jordan actually gave us a lot of the answers here. So I'm glad you made good use of it. That's for sure.
Oh, definitely.
Well, before we jump in, because something I want to do here It will be kind of fun, I think, hopefully for the viewers. And we've been talking about it over social media that we were going to do it, which was because you're kind of into Shadow Rising right now, the Shadow Rising, we want to actually kind of riff on that and have fun with some really interesting stuff that happens in the Shadow Rising. But before we do that, give me your general opinion of the Watt TV series coming out. Just generally, where are you at? Are you really excited?
Ooh.
Are you trepidatious at this point? Like, what's your thought about it?
So I'll say I'm erring on the side of excited. I still have a few reservations. There are a few things that worry me a little bit about some of the, maybe the character decisions they're going to take. But as the casting rolls out, I have just gotten more and more excited. I, for the most part, love the casting decisions. I mean, Moiraine and Matt, I think, are absolutely perfect. I think Perrin and Lan and Egwene are great. I'm a little lukewarm on Nynaeve and Rand, but the more I've kind of looked into, what was it, Joshua Stradowski and then Zoe Robbins, the more I've looked into their past work and kind of looked at more pictures than videos of them, I'm coming around on them more. But overall, I'd say I'm excited, and the biggest thing is that it's happening. I never imagined that I would one day get to sit down with, my friends and my wife and turn on the TV and the wheel of time will be on the screen. I mean,
yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that is where I'm at, which is my kids haven't really read the books, but hopefully they'll watch the TV series. Like they're finally going to learn who these people are. I love my wife dearly. She'll always throw out like Asmodene is always like in her head, and Lanfear, she always switches the genders in those. So Lanfear is always a man for her. Like for some, like just in her head, like Lanfear. And I think it probably maybe comes from the fact that Lan is a male character in the series or something. But it's always funny. But to me, it's gonna be like, I mean, I don't know how far it's gonna get. I hope it gets really far. I hope it goes all the way to the end. Mm-hmm. But if it doesn't, it'd be really nice though if they kind of caught up on the characters. That part excites me a lot about what's about to happen. So one more note for Inking Out Loud: where can people find you? Like if they're interested, if they're listening to this, when it comes to listening to your podcast, like where can you be found?
Yeah, so we're on pretty much all the major podcast platforms. We're on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher. We have a YouTube channel. We're on SoundCloud. That's our kind of major platform, and all of our episodes are available to download there. And I think there are a couple at Last FM, maybe. There's so many podcast platforms that I like to send out applications to. It's hard to keep track of them all, but the major ones are where you can find us for sure.
Okay, great. Yeah,
I do want to add.
Yeah, go for it.
One more thing, just about the podcast. If maybe some people might not be interested in this, but some might. One of our unique twists, I think, is that we, while we discuss these science fiction fantasy novels, we do a little segment at the end of every episode called The Final Draft, because we're writers, we got to make a little writing pun there. But we talk about what drinks we have over the course of the episode, and we try to find thematically appropriate beers. And I've had a lot of fun with that, especially living in Fort Collins, Colorado, which is like a craft beer mecca. There's all kinds of great stuff to find here. And I'll save it for a little bit later in our conversation, but I actually brought what I think is a pretty nice thematic beer for our conversation a little later.
Awesome. No, yeah. Well, like Drew said, you can find some of the links to his to the podcast that he and Rob host. And you can find that in the description of the YouTube video you're watching right now. Please check them out. They're a lot of fun. For me, obviously, I've listened to your first couple when it comes to the Wheel of Time, and I like you guys dig into it. I mean, of course, right? I'm kind of expecting you to say some things. So, I think I might have told you this once. There's like this moment where I'm pausing and waiting for you to bring up some particular fact, not because I want to hear the fact, but because then I want to hear the conversation around that fact. So that's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much again for being with us. Don't go anywhere, everyone, because we're about to begin really a really fun segment, which when it comes to the Shadow Rising is, the geekiness or the ability to kind of geek out about the metaphysics, all the crazy stuff that happens in that book is a lot of fun. So I want to welcome onto the call Chris Cottingham. We want him to come in and be part of this. Chris, welcome to the show. It's good to have you here.
Hey guys.
Hey, Chris is another. Chris is one of a few individuals at JordanCon. It's a convention that's dedicated to Robert Jordan and the Wheel of Time series. When we meet up on Thursday night before it begins, definitely you can find a couple of us sitting off in a corner and just picking a topic and riffing on it and just having a lot of fun with it. And so I thought, since we had Drew with us, why not grab Chris? And Chris was ready and willing. So Chris, welcome to the show, and let's get started. The Shadow Rising is a lot of fun, so I want to do this kind of round robin and we'll give Drew the first option here. Drew, what's something that's from the Shadow Rising that you kind of wanted to throw out to the three of us and have us kind of tear down a little bit?
Well, let's dive straight into the deep end, and let's talk about Rand's journey through the columns in Rhiudean and this cache of Ter'angreal that we find in a lost city in the waste.
Yeah. Okay. Well, lead it off.
Yeah. So first off, I think this is one of the most brilliantly written segments in the entire series. It is some of Robert Jordan's finest work. I think a lot of people who are fans of the Wheel of Time will agree with that. It's just packed with emotion, packed with world building and implications for not only the future of the series, but the past of the series as well. And it also gives us a lot of room for theorizing, because we have in these early books in Great Hunt and Dragon Reborn, we have the accepted Ter'angreal and we have the portal stones and which make a return here. And now we have another Ter'angreal, another object of the power that puts a character in an alternate life of one variety or another. It brings back to mind, that idea of like parallel and perpendicular worlds and mirror worlds and manipulating the weave of the pattern to give us these new crazy experiences.
What's your feeling? Do you think that this showed up? Do you think this is something that the Gen created? And by the way, really quick before we answer that question, major spoilers at this point, but that are up and down the series. Oh, yeah. So just recognize that if you're listening at this point, but not necessarily spoilers like we're going to ruin the book. It's just we're going to get into what these Ter'angreal do, and so we're going to be talking kind of back into the Second Age, and maybe even into the Fourth Age. We're going to be talking about some things here that might spoil a couple things for you. So just remember that. But to that question, do you two think that this is a Ter'angreal that was brought to this area, or do you think it was created once they got there, once Rhiudean was created itself?
So my impression always was that it was created in Rhiudean. It was the two ancient Aes Sedai, these relics of the Age of Legends that we see in the very first flashback of the gathering of the Sept Chiefs and the sort of organization of the IOL. I always assumed they were the creators of it, because these are big objects, they're and at least in the scenes we see in the flashbacks, going further back to the Gen caravan and their attempt to preserve all of these objects of power and the Chora cuttings and things like that, we don't have descriptions of these giant glass columns, in the, caravan beds or anything like that. And I think they were specifically created by those two Aes Sedai to give this challenge to the IOL, because these Aes Sedai, obviously, as women who were alive during the Age of Legends and during the Breaking, they knew what the Gen were, and they knew, in the moment what the IOL had become. And so I think they understood what it would really take to unify the Aiel and what sort of people it would take to lead them well. And this Ter'angreal was their sort of magnum opus, their final attempt to create this grounding device for what could have been, one of the most volatile civilizations in the world.
Is that your kind of belief too, Chris? Do you think this was something that they kind of created once they were there, or that they maybe, I guess in my head it's at least possible that they brought something along that maybe was already there and they just added onto it, if that makes sense. Maybe not. You know what I mean? Like it's they had a foundation of what they wanted to build. Is that how you kind of consider it, Chris?
Honestly, I don't think I'd ever thought about this question before.
that's why we're doing this.
It's one of the reasons I always enjoy talking to you guys, because you make me think new things. I think it could go either way. Obviously, they brought a lot of stuff with them, wagon load after wagon load. I think it definitely would have taken the two ancient Aes Sedai that Drew mentions to set them up and activate them. Speaking of spoilers, we know from Avienda's experience at the end of the novels, we know that they can have multiple settings and serve multiple functions. So I think those two Aes Sedai had to have set them up in Rhiudean and set them to do the function that they did for the Aiel. So I agree completely with Drew about that they would have set them up and done so specifically to shape the future of the Aiel in the way that they do. At least one of those Aes Sedai seems to me like she has the foretelling, and that she would be probably the source for the prophecy of Rhiudean, because she speaks during that flashback, and she basically gives the foretelling about Rian's coming, that he will take you back and he will destroy you. He will come from Rhiudean at dawn, so on and so forth. So definitely operating in future knowledge, they would have set those Ter'angreal up to shape the Aiel in the way that the pattern needed.
So, but do you think that is it thread based then? As far as the thread in the pattern itself, is it soul based? What do you think is happening here? Considering what's happening from an experiential standpoint, is it, 'cause I don't know. To me, that there's this idea of creating these Ter'angreal that are so complicated in this way. And when you say it's just these two individuals went to Rhiudean and somehow they were able to make it work, and maybe that's just they just happen to have a lot of experience in this regard. But do you think this is kind of directly tied specifically from the physical blood, whatever thread perspective, or do you think this is somewhat soul based?
Well, the fact of how complicated they are is something I was going to mention, because that is something that makes me a little skeptical that they actually created the Ter'angreal there. I would, if I had to bet money on it, I would be more inclined to say that they took Ter'angreal that were already there and knew the function of them and set them up to work the way they wanted to work, rather than creating them from scratch, because the level of technology, of one power technology that was needed to create those things seems like it would be pretty high. There's some things that Elaine is able to make without any support, but there's a lot of stuff that's beyond her. And those items seem like something that's pretty far beyond anything that we see Elaine make in the series. So I'm dodging your other question, by the way. Maybe Drew will answer it.
So
Drew,
I'll address. I'll address that. And I do think it's thread-based, because souls we know are not necessarily reborn along bloodlines. We obviously Lews Theron's entire bloodline was wiped out, and yet his soul is reborn, and there isn't necessarily like a succession of blonde-haired archers that have transcended the ages or anything like that. Whereas when we consider what the weave of the pattern is and what the age lace is, each person's life must be inextricably tied together with their ancestors and their children. And so I think it would be a logical step to take for an Aes Sedai who wanted to craft a Ter'angreal like this to do it in a way that latches onto your thread and goes all the way back to the beginning of it and finds what thread it was attached to, and then goes back and so on and so forth.
Okay, so is that why you think, because there's a question, there's a comment in YouTube, I think it was John, was talking about Avienda's second trip, right? So if we broke this down, do you believe that the trip backward is an exact kind of factual representation of, because it's thread-based and it's reading the age lace in that way, and so it's taking you down what actually happened, but when it comes to a second trip through that's more future-based, do you think that then it's more, open to changes? Or do you think what she saw was more set in stone?
So I think it was more predictive along the future lines. Once again, obviously it's tied to like threads in the pattern because it follows her, her descendants. But as that weave has not yet come to be yet, I think, I think it's more of a prediction of what would be easy for these threads to do. What would be the easy way for them to be woven together going forward? The natural path, considering where the threads lie at the moment of Avienda's second interaction with the Ter'angreal. Maybe there is an aspect of foretelling in it as well. I don't know if we can really say that those two Aes Sedai who were with the Gen in that vision of Rand's had the foretelling, but I think it's possible, very possible, at least one of them did. And I think that would make sense as to why they might have created these Ter'angreal in the first place. So I think it falls together rather neatly if that's the case.
Yeah, I mean, Jordan does, he's brought in these Ter'angreal, right? And that's going to be, when we jump to my round robin here shortly after Chris, something, one of the things I'm going to bring up, because this idea that there's these Ter'angreal that can somehow interface with the age lace and somehow read it in a reliable way. You could tie the foretellings to that same capability. You could tie Min's viewings to that same, now maybe a more natural talent mechanism that's embedded in the thread of that person's life versus that's embedded in a machine. But it's really interesting when you take this Ter'angreal, right? What do you think? I mean, you think it's a setting of some sort? Like the future. This is the 65 percentile, version of the future. This is the, is it the most likely future? Is it the, you know what I mean? Like you have a lot of, when they say any future that can be, will be, when it comes to the mirror worlds, you have a lot of variation here. So in my head, I'm just going like, is it like something where they interface with the Ter'angreal and they just, imagine this Ter'angreal back in the Age of Legends, like what would its purpose be? And it's like, you want to see your most likely future? Do you want to see your least likely future? Those kind of things kind of go off in my head of, like, do you both think that they set this Ter'angreal up to show the most likely probability as far as the pattern is concerned?
I would think so, but I think we see with Avienda and the ideal that the fact of knowing your probable future makes it less likely to come about, at least if you don't want it to come about and you start taking actions to prevent it. There are all these prophetic elements, foretellings, viewings, and dreams and everything else. But I think Jordan is doing the same thing that he does with all kinds of other concepts that have a balance. There has to be a balance between light and shadow. There's a balance between Sidene and Sidar. And I think that's true for prophecy or destiny or the pattern and free will on the other. That, if we look at the end of the story, and the idea of free will is essential to this world. And so there's some aspect where free will has to be preserved. So however accurate those devices are, whether it's 65% or 85 or 25 or what have you, there has to be some aspect of free will preserved.
Man, you're bringing up like a huge topic here, this free will thing. I mean, if we could probably fill a show of that. Like, I want to, like, my brain wants me to take me down that, like, super AI connection to free will and Ishmael's desire to destroy the pattern, and kind of how I feel a little bit. I understand what he's saying. If you can see all of your futures and pasts and you realize that you're just a cog on a machine, then what the hell's the machine for anyway? So anyways, but I don't want to go there. I don't want to go there too far down there, but I think you're right. Maybe the element of free will is part of this as far as the probability standpoint. There was a question that came up in YouTube. Scott asked, did those Aes Sedai know that the Karakan and the Dragon Reborn would be the same person?
Yes.
Ooh. Yeah, I think so. And that's why I think at least one of them had the foretelling.
Yeah.
Okay. So you think they just that's an interesting. They have to know that, right? This part of me wants to go. Pattern wheel interaction in there. Also, it's not 100% necessary, but yeah, I think if we leave it along those free will lines, that would make sense.
Yeah.
Well, and they talk about.
I think.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think this interaction of like future knowledge and free will is really important in how it shapes some of the characters going forward, especially in this specific set of chapters in The Shadow Rising, where not only do we have Rand gaining future knowledge, but we have Matt acting or attempting to act on the future knowledge he was given by the Aelfin. And we also have Moiraine and Aviendha going through the ring Ter'angreal in Rhiudean and gaining their own brand of future knowledge,
Oh man, the ring Ter'angreal. I mean, goodness. I mean, so the ring Ter'angreal. Let's go there. Is that something they brought with them? I mean, it feels like that one's something they brought with them. It's very similar to some of the other Ter'angreal that existed. So, I mean, I don't want to jump down that road. Anyways, I want to come back to that one because that one. To me, that one has so much potential for adding a dimension to the Forsaken, for example. I mean, we jump back to the Age of Legends. If that thing existed, some of these Forsaken whose futures, right? What would that future have been for them if they had looked at that? Let's say they went in through those rings, right after, like 5 years after the Boar was created. What would they have seen? You know what I mean? Like,
right.
Would they have seen some of their futures in the Third Age?
Yeah, I think two things. One, I think some of them at least probably did. And the reason I think that is because my thought on those ring Ter'angreal was always that they were a reverse engineered version of the Portal Stones, where it was Aes Sedai studying the Portal Stones and creating something to let people see, quote, what might be.
You take it more kind of a controlled setting instead of actually using the portals. Instead of doing the Toman head journey that Rand forced everybody down. That's an interesting question. They reverse engineered portal stones to create those. But I think it adds an interesting question like Lanfear. Did she see the Third Age coming? And was that part of her plans, right? Is that part of Ishmael's plans? They add this dimension. Jordan doesn't talk about it, right? But these things came from the Age of Legends, and we jokingly talked. I think it's something you tweeted about, Drew. This idea that there's these mirror world travel agencies, right? Like the use of these Ter'angreal that we see show up in Rhiudean, or that are in the White Tower, or even even look at the Redstone Ter'angreal doorways, right? Like these parallel dimensions and such. If you put these things into the context of the Age of Legends, they start having more entertainment value than they have. I mean, we think of them and here's this very serious, use of these things in Rhiudean, for the Aiel, but you put these things back in a mall, in the Age of Legends or whatever, and all of a sudden you're like, you're paying $1,000 and it's like, show me show me something from my past, my present, and my future, or show me 1,000, how many iterations of your what do you have to pay to see, 1,000 lives of your future? Like,
it occurs to me that we don't actually know that they would show the future then. We don't know that they ever did that before Avian messed with them.
But like talk about portal stones though, and like the ring Ter'angreal
like the ring Ter'angreal in Rhiudean, because that one shows you, that one we do know, like outside of the columns, that one did function that way. Like it showed you variations. Now, they always talked about how that was like an experience when you come out of it that you don't really remember that much, but clearly you remember some things. So even if the Forsaken had used it that way, I'm not saying they would remember all of these potential futures, but it's just interesting to me that you don't really think about that the Forsaken might have, seen some of the future in those moments, potentially.
Yeah. And I think it's likely that some of them did. And I saw a question popped up in the chat from Joe Lott. He said, if they had those Ter'angreal during the Age of Legends, why didn't anyone see the breaking of the world, or did they? And I think it's likely they did, but the way these Ter'angreal work and the way portal stones work provides such an insane variety of possible futures that it's likely if anybody went through that and saw the world being torn asunder and essentially ending, they would think, wow, that's super unlikely. That's not going to happen.
Well, I mean, but think about, like, go down that road a little bit.
We live in this utopia, world of peace, why would we expect,
Well, let me piggyback on that for a second, because all of these devices that we know about, whether it's the thing they use for the Accepted or in Rhiudean or what have you, they're all dangerous. And it's we don't know what they were originally used for in the Age of Legends, but we do know that people often don't come back from them. And also have had Rand with Loose Theron's memories talking about the Age of Legends as, not being so great as legend says, that there was more conflict, but there was also more decadence. Anyway, what I'm getting at is I wonder how much they would have risked death for knowledge of the future, and how widespread that would have been.
Yeah, I think that's a good question to ask, which is, how much would you pay? Like if something that, a friend went through it, right? A friend knocked on your door and was like, dude, I was just down at the mall and the new I Fly Through My Future just, installed, it was there and whatever. And I paid $1,000 and it was amazing. And I saw X, would you believe him? And all of a sudden it was like, well, I want to try that out. Right. Like, because this concept, they wouldn't know necessarily that those futures would have happened. That stuff would happen later. Right. And they'd be like, hey, 20 years ago, I remember this thing that I saw in this machine. I guess it does kind of work, or maybe I'm just making that up, but I kind of wonder how many of us would actually use that thing. Because you're right, the danger factor is really good. And I think that's a good piece that Jordan added into it, which is
here's the other thing about that. The elfin, the snakes, can read aspects of the future.
Yeah.
But you used to answer questions. It's dangerous to ask them questions that touch on the shadow. Why is that? Well, I would guess that it's because the dark is actively trying to break the pattern and warping the pattern and warping the threads. And we see that all throughout the later books when, suddenly the layout of a city streets or the layout of a palace, the rooms in the palace change, or, someone randomly catches on fire or is devoured from the inside by bugs. But it seems to me that all of those changes in reality are shiftings of the pattern as the Dark One is trying to break free. And, maybe suddenly you're getting the layout of, when the rooms shift around in Cainlin in the palace, maybe you're getting a layout from a different mirror world, and bits and pieces of the pattern from other worlds are slipping in. I don't know if that's true or not, but the point is the shadow is actively trying to distort and destroy the pattern. So I wonder, with the Forsaken, how much useful future knowledge they could have gotten as close to the shadow as they were. I wonder how much it distorts the future.
That's an interesting question when it comes from the perspective of the Dark One's touch. I mean, before the bore occurred, and maybe that's what it is. Maybe it's just afterwards. That's an interesting point. Maybe some of these things came down through rumors because maybe after the bore came out, all of a sudden the complexion of the futures people saw in these things actually had some kind of self-fulfilling prophecy kind of effect, right? Like all of a sudden it was like all the futures people saw were like death and destruction, and they, maybe that made people kind of crazy, and maybe it made them more likely and susceptible to the Dark One's influence, right? Like all of a sudden, I mean, think about Ishmael. I think it's his knowledge of the past and future. I think it's his interactions with the Dark One and that awareness that, in many ways kind of just suck all the hope out of him for life in general. Like in the end, like he likes to see the destruction because in many ways I think he just anticipates it. He sees that that's in his mind, the end of all things is just the destruction of life, and sure, it comes back again, but it's the same thing over and over again. So maybe there's something to what you're saying, which is the Dark One's influence, when it comes to these kind of things is significant, and it should be used with care. Although let's be honest, not everything is used with care. That just because you have a danger label on it, that doesn't mean that's gonna, anyone's gonna care that the danger label exists. And I'm sure you had to write sign some contract, like, that this may lead to your eventual death because you can't handle what you see, or something like that. But yeah, that's an interesting point, Chris. Sorry, I wasn't sure if I was speaking over you, Drew.
No, you're good. Sorry. I had to.
No, I wasn't sure if you were. Yeah, I wasn't sure if you were like consuming that piece. I was like, I figured Drew probably has something about this that's bubbling in his head. But one of the pieces I want to talk about, but I'll save mine for the end there. Chris, I want to give you a chance when it comes to Shadow Rising. What's a piece of the Shadow Rising that that you wanted to kind of throw out here in this round robin of discussion that you really like or want to kind of break down?
This may trample on what you want to talk about, Matt.
No, go for it.
And if it does, jump in.
Well, that'll be great. Then we can jump right into it.
Well, I didn't reread the book or really review. I did look at the sequence with the Ter'angreal and Rhiudean, and I also, just to kind of get into the flow of the narrative, I read the chapter before Rand goes into the pillars, and in that chapter, at the end of that chapter, the wise ones are going to begin training Egwene, and so they start talking to her about Ter'angreal, and it struck me that the knowledge that the wise ones show at this point in the story is very specific. Like they knew very specifically that Moiraine Damodred would be in the Stone of Tyr, and they knew about when she would be there, and they knew what day people needed to get to Rhiudean, and they knew that Moiraine needed to go through the pillars, and they knew that in all the futures they had seen, it was always Moiraine who had mentioned it.
You are totally stepping on my topic here, which I love.
Yeah.
So good. Awesome. I'm sure Drew, I think I mentioned this to Drew, like, oh man, I want to talk about this thing. So I'm sure he's listening to you like, yes, that's exactly. Yes, go on.
I knew you wanted to say something about dreaming and dreamwalking. But yeah, so it's very specific. And what we see from Egwene later on is all of this symbolism and all of this interpretation required. And they do talk about how the wise ones do talk about how it requires interpretation, but we never see that kind of specificity from Egwene that I can think of.
Yeah, never. Okay, so this is so. Let me read some of the quotes. Let me read some of the quotes because this is so important. This is my argument for the fact that dreamwalking is the least identified talent in the books once it's brought up, because I believe that Jordan, once Jordan brought this up, he was like, yeah, this would be a really lame book if I just walked around and showed you what the wise ones are doing. Yeah, why even have this story? Because they say there is no one set path to the future. The pattern makes the finest lace look coarse, woven sacking or tangled string. In Ter'angreal, it is possible to see some ways the future may be woven, no more than that. She says, much is uncertain even to a dream walker. Amy's and Melaine are the best of us, and even they do not see all that is, or that all that can be. All, right? That was the qualification was, look, we have some good Dreamwalkers. They're really great, and even they can't see every single thing, right? What that suggests to you is, at least for me, it's like 80%. You know what I mean? Like, this is not
right.
This is not like they're only seeing like a future, right? One of the quotes is, "The present is much clearer than the future in Ter'angreal. What is happening or beginning is more easily seen than what will happen." And she's like, "We didn't see Egwene or Matt coming, but we did know she says, it was no more than an even chance that the young man who calls himself Rand al'Thor would come. If he did not, it was certain that he would die, and the Aiel too. Yet he has come, and if he survives Rhiudean, some of the Aiel at least will survive. This we know." Like, that's a fact. Like, that wasn't... Yes. That was future, right? That's the future of the Aiel. They knew for a fact with that talent, and this doesn't get brought up enough. I think I've brought it up with Brandon a couple times. This is a very specific kind of talent that we, like you just said, Chris, that doesn't get addressed and talked about very much once this portion of the books ends. So anyway, sorry.
So I have kind of a continuation of that, but before I get there, I want to go back to my earlier point about what we do with the Inking Out Loud podcast and the thematically appropriate beers.
Please do, yeah. If this is a good moment.
And today I brought a beer from Paradox Brewing Company in Divide, Colorado, and I'll put this up on the camera, called Future Knowledge.
Excellent.
That's a good.
So,
it's the perfect time. You know that was coming. You're like, this is I'd mentioned this to Drew maybe a week ago of like, I really want to talk about this topic. So Paradox, nice. Well, we'll break that open. Hopefully you are. Oh, I didn't look over there. Good. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, so where I was going to kind of jump off on this idea of like how seemingly overpowered Dreamwalking was initially set up to be, and I think what Robert Jordan ended up doing with it was he kind of deconstructed it and broke it into dreaming with a capital D and Dreamwalking, and because the Aiel Dreamwalkers have all these prophetic visions, and they dictate so much of the course of events in the middle part of the series, but then in the latter part of the series that goes away. And they essentially just become, Ter'angreal masters. So I think Robert Jordan realized what a dangerous sort of precedent he was creating, narratively speaking. Like from the writer's perspective, like this is essentially a Deus Ex Machina, and he managed to and quietly sort of shuffle that under the rug and make everybody forget about it.
Not everybody.
Well, yeah, not everybody.
No, that's what I mean. Well, yeah. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah. So, Matt, when you were reading the quote earlier, it struck me. You were reading the quote about how I think you said in Ter'angreal that the future can be seen, or the present can be seen more easily than the future.
Yes.
But implying that you can see the future when you're in the dream world. And that's not how it works for Egwene. She doesn't see visions of the future in Ter'angreal, and she sees them in her dreams. It does kind of work that way for Perrin, which I've always thought was strange, that he sometimes has these, he's in the world of dreams and he suddenly sees these windows or something open up in the sky and has these visions. And that's always struck me as odd, that it's kind of a different mechanism for him. He sees the future than it is for Egwene. It makes me wonder if for some of the Dreamwalkers, maybe they see, windows in the sky or something like what Perrin sees. But I'm inclined to think that it's more what Drew was just saying, that Jordan kind of backed the idea.
Well, he had to, right? I mean, in the end, like you said, we don't have any.
Yeah.
Right. We don't have any Dreamwalkers in reality. Like, I mean, the wise ones, but we don't really get in their minds while they're doing it, right? We see dreaming.
Right.
We see Egwene actually. I mean, her dreaming capabilities, and I think, and maybe this is it. Maybe that's just something they don't teach that much, right? And I'm willing to go there. I'm willing to kind of riff off of the idea that it's such a dangerous thing. That look at Egwene, right? They're just training her right at the beginning, right? It's not like we get decades of their training to Egwene, right? We get the very beginning, and they're like, yeah, we'll show you these pieces, but we're not going to show you that whole thing where, and that might be, maybe she can learn what they're doing, but there's just not skills they were going. And I'm willing to go down that road in the deconstruction side of things because I think you're right. In the end, he had to, because imagine this for a moment. It's like Rand arrives at a city. There's a letter waiting for him. you know what I mean? Like, and the letter tells him, hey, good, you arrived here. That means the IOL are still going to survive. Awesome. Keep going. Whatever. It's like they're always sending letters out to let people know, like, things are looking good, or meet us over here because we need you to, just in case. It's like that letter. I think in the end, I wonder, right? I wish he was here. Not that he would ever say, like, no, I didn't want to put that letter in there, but that letter that they send, and that they use to get to Rhiudean in the end, that letter changes the whole kind of complexion of what kind of access someone has from a talent perspective to the future, right? Like, and maybe it's not that big of a deal, I guess. We have Ter'angreal that do similar things, but when they're like, we knew these things would not happen if this didn't happen, or this would happen if this didn't happen. That's to me, I don't want to belabor it too much, but that's big.
Well, I think part of where this plays out in the second half of the series, this sort of like nerfing, so to speak, of Dreamwalking, allows, for instance, Avienda's, way forward, second trip through the columns. If Dreamwalking had stayed this powerful, foretelling, ability for Amis and Mullane, and there would have been no reason for Avienda to need to go through, because these wise ones have been getting these visions and these premonitions of the future of the Aiel all along, and then they kind of just stop, and it falls to Avienda to go back through the columns a second time and return with this portentous news of what could happen to the Aiel.
Yeah.
There's at least two other possibilities I can think of.
Go for it.
So one is related to what I was saying before about the shadow twisting the pattern and making visions of the future more unreliable. And I think there is a line of dialogue in one of the last three books, which I haven't reread nearly as much as the others.
Yeah.
Since I haven't, I've reread the series once since it finished, as opposed to reading it every year or two. But I feel like a lot of dialogue, the Dreamwalkers, where they talk about how uncertain things are until I run around, how, I know they tell Egwene at one point that they're not going to be going into the dream anymore, that it's become so unstable until I run around.
Yes.
I don't know if they say specifically something about the dream becoming more unclear, more difficult to read. But that's one possibility, is that their future knowledge just gets more uncertain. The other possibility is that I forget the thing.
You're like, no, but the one you just brought up is a really good one. Drew, did you have something? I have a comment on it, but I can hear you. Was there something you were going to say about that one?
No, I was just laughing about Chris talking about his lack of rereads for the final few books, because I'm exactly in the same boat. I mean, that was my downfall at JordanCon Trivia this year. I was given a question about Avienda's second trip through the columns, and I was like, I don't know. I haven't read Towers of Midnight since 2013.
Well, to Chris's point, and I'm willing to go there. That's true. And I would like to say this: it's not that Dreamwalking is an infallible talent, right? It's clearly fallible, right? They were talking about how some things didn't happen that they thought would. So it's not a one-to-one. It's not this is the future. This is what's going to be. I mean, there's clearly some, like, maybe we don't know that there were letters waiting in lots of cities. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, we just need them to get here. They could end up over there, and they could end up over there. Let's just have them. Let's go wait in all those places wherever they show up. But I think that you're right in the sense that I think the other, that we don't know all of the kind of work that they do to try to cover it, because what their goal was the survival of the Aiel, right? That's all. Yeah. At least that's how I read them. That's how I read them the entire time, which is like, everyone else is cool, and it's important, and we like to save the world, but let's be totally honest, it's the survival of that Aiel that matters, right? And the actions that they were taking were related to that. And so I can imagine that the Dark One's touch on the pattern, right, would absolutely have an effect where they might start not trusting what they're seeing, right? Maybe they were doing a lot of dreamwalking, and the things that they all kind of agreed on, they're like reviewing notes together and like, none of this stuff happened, and we thought it should have or was going to. And so it's no longer reliable in the way that we want to make decisions, right? Because it's one thing, right? You have this power and ability, you would imagine, so you could make changes or decisions. But if they can no longer rely on that, it's too infallible. I'm willing to go down those roads. It's just a really interesting thing that we don't. Dreamwalking is not ever detailed and explained by the wise ones or by Jordan or by anyone, even as far as I know, the encyclopedias. I don't even remember it being in the notes. Like some of the notes that we have from that library that Therese took scans of. I've read through those, and I don't remember ever seeing the breakdown. Where Jordan didn't like write a scene of one of the wise ones and show the process. So, and maybe it's not as Sorry, go ahead, Chris.
I feel like I should insert here that I was going to be looking at the notes this week, but Hurricane Dorian stopped me, so I don't have to. I'll look at when I go back. But yeah, I had a planned a trip to Charleston planned this weekend.
Yeah, when you do go, I mean, maybe that's a really good. That's a good one. We should look those up and see if there's anything that topically. I mean, I feel like we would have already kind of seen those particularly, but we do have a YouTuber asked, didn't wise ones give up dream walking temporarily because of chosen walking the dream world? And that's there too, right? It's a much more dangerous proposition, and this was brought up about the Ter'angreal. Like in the end of the day, some of this is really dangerous, and that's a good point, right? In the end of the day, there are other people walking the dream world that are. They would rather, the wise ones would rather survive at this point, and the Aiel survive than having to try to grab maybe, again, kind of go into the dream world and do some dream walking and potentially, be killed. So that's right. That's a good point.
And we're approaching a lot of this like this idea of dream walking as a very powerful ability that Robert Jordan. Or not necessarily that Robert Jordan nerfed. All right, let me try to rephrase this. We've been discussing it as this ability that was sort of shoveled under the rug and forgotten in the series, and we've had several really good reasons in world for why this was.
Yeah.
And I would just like to kind of like pull it out to the writer's perspective and say that like it is very likely Robert Jordan saw that, and he wrote in those situations like. Even though only a couple of the chosen were actual dreamwalkers, he suddenly was like, okay, well, what if I had a bunch of them entering in the flesh and constantly being in Ter'angreal? This gives me an excuse to rein in the dreamwalker's ability, to shape future events. Things like that. He was an eminently creative man. It's, it makes sense that he could, as a writer, weave these threads that he's built in to give himself a canonically consistent out, so to speak.
I agree with all the with that general principle. I would quibble with some details because that's who I am, and that's what we do when we talk.
You can quibble. Look, this is about as geeky, right? This is about as geeky. I don't even know if anyone's watching, right? Other than a couple of you. This is about as geeky as it gets, right? We're trying to like deep dive into the mechanics of talents and Ter'angreal and how those might have been applied throughout the different ages. And a lot of this stuff Jordan didn't ever really talk about, right? Like, and that's what's fun about this. So quibble away, right? This whole thing is just one significant quibble.
Well, it occurs to me, Drew, I think it was you that called dreamwalking, something that could be a deus ex machina. But we already have that with men's viewings.
We already have like 10 deus ex machinas, including Dale Domar.
Yeah, men's viewings is one of the most. It's one of the most glaring to me because we're told, her viewings always come true, and she doesn't always know what they mean. But if she's always exactly right, and that's never, justified anywhere. We're just told that.
So
everybody accepts that.
I think that's a really important point that you just brought up with Min's viewings, and this ties back to the Aelfin.
Yeah.
This is the only instance, or the only two instances of for sure future knowledge. All these other things with the Ter'angreal and the portal stones, and these are all possibilities. But when Min knows, she knows, and it's gonna happen. And yes, we're given later in the series this idea of like, oh well, what if the Dark One breaks the pattern? But ultimately, he does not.
Right.
So
foretellings are also for sure if one can understand them.
Yeah, at least those
yeah.
Those are obscured a little bit from trying to understand. But yeah, that's
and the way, but the way Jordan, makes that not break the series and not be this Deus ex machina that solves everything is sometimes Min doesn't know what the viewings mean, and sometimes she doesn't get things. And it'd be easy enough to do the same thing with Dreamwalking, to say, oh, they just didn't dream about that. Can
I point out something? It is the Dark One. It is the Dark One that makes the story interesting, right? At the end of the day, if you went to the Age of Legends pre-Dark One, they were like, they're boring.
Yeah.
right? Like in the end, a lot of these things, like the wheel is in itself, right? It's self-fulfilling, right? It's persisting its own self and maintaining itself by, in many ways, controlling certain events, or if you will, giving certain talents to people, where it's like, hey, that thing that you went through, that Ter'angreal, yeah, that's not as clear as let me just tell you what's going to happen, and that's why we have Min. She'll just be like, oh, this means this person's going to marry this person. In other words, it has that, at least. But that's what I like about what the story Jordan's telling us about is mostly post-Boar, right? It's that, and I guess like the Boar is what removed the boredom from their lives, right? It added it added. I know it was terrible, but in the end, it added value, right? It added value to the storytelling itself, right? Why tell the story before the Boar? I mean, it's interesting, but it's not as compelling.
I mean, Robert Jordan's he was even on record as saying, because of course so many people were like, hey, are we ever going to get a story about the Age of Legends? Are we ever going to see the Age of Legends? And Robert Jordan said straight out, no, because it would be boring.
Right?
When there's no conflict and there's no, like why would I bother writing that story? Nothing's going to happen.
Yeah, no.
The only story that would be really interesting there is like around the making of the Boar, or the the War of Power, and he at least gave us the strike at Sheol Ghul, which wraps all that up. So
I mean, you could have like a sort of Jane Austen comedy of manners thing, and you could have and Ilmina and Luther.
Well, yeah.
Love triangle. I'm just kidding. No.
Sorry, I did not mean to offend anyone who wrote a story before the Boar happened. I'm sure. Yes, that's true. No, you bring up good points. We could have a story all about how Luther and Elon.
Yeah, I'm sure
they learn how to sword fight.
A fanfic out there.
A comment came in from Scott, and he said he always thought Egwene's prophetic dreaming was different than dreamwalking, and asked, and kind of what we had said, which was because he said she has dreams that separate from her trips to Ter'angreal, were the wise ones doing it differently to see the future? And I think they had to have been, right?
Yes.
It's not that I don't think that Egwene could not have done what they do. I don't think it was. I think the way that they interacted with Ter'angreal was probably inherently, from a talent standpoint, different from her experience, but that doesn't mean both of those could not be that the mechanisms that they were doing couldn't have been taught, right? I just think in the end, there's two compelling reasons why it wasn't. One, I think, is an in-world reason, which is completely valid. Would you have trusted Egwene in that moment? Like, here is the key to the kingdom of Ter'angreal, and because it probably is very dangerous. My guess is there is a dangerous element to that, in part to the thing that was brought up by Chris before, which was, seeing too much of the future, you know, again, how would that affect you as a person? You know, does it become self-fulfilling? How do you choose what you're going to do with that information? You know, look what they did. Like, they weren't sure, right? Here's people that were so experienced in this talent, and here comes these, you know, Rand and Moraine and Egwene. They're all there like, whoa, hey, you wrote us a letter. We're here. And they're like, yeah, but that, we don't even know if that was supposed to happen. And that right there, that never showed up to us. And we have no idea what, you know, they're sitting there going like, we need to go back into Ter'angreal and find out what the hell we just did, right? Like, what did we just change? Like what just happened, right? Because they're experiencing these things, and these are really, really talented people in this, you know, in this regard.
Yeah.
So why would they teach Egwene to do those things, you know?
And we see what it does to characters like Min and Matt, to their mental states over the course of the series when they have this knowledge. I mean, Matt's obsessed at certain points with, like, he's meeting random barmaids in Meron, and he's like, do you know who the daughter of the Nine Moons is? Like, you know, because he has this knowledge, and it's you know, he's becoming paranoid about it. And then with Min especially, I mean, she sees these horrific things that she knows she can't stop, and it takes a toll on her. Yeah. We see it especially at the beginning of Dragon Reborn, and by proxy that, you know, she tells Perrin, and Perrin agonizes it over the first, you know, couple of chapters there with Leia, and he's like, I need to do everything I can, and he has this panic attack when Rand creates the earthquake, and he's like, oh my gosh, did Rand kill Leia? And he finds out she was just slightly injured, and he was like, oh, well, maybe Min's viewing was wrong. And then 4 hours later, Trollocs attack the camp, and she gets killed. And you know, and that coincides with one of Perrin's most fraught engagements with his wolf brotherness, so to speak, where he loses himself to the wolves in that scene. He, in the middle of the camp, in the middle of everybody there, he has such mental anguish that he gives himself over to the wolves and howls. Yeah. You know, like, and all these Shi'anarans are like watching him like, dude, like, what? You okay there, bud? You know, and so we see the ramifications of future knowledge not necessarily always being good for the development of these characters.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look at Aleda, you know, I mean, when you have foretelling, when you have these kind of things come in, they're not as always, they're not as cool and as you might think they're going to be. And so even that's what I do like that. If Jordan did bake that in, which is, look, I'm coming up with this, I'm adding this capability, and maybe from the first blush, it seems like this is going to be an amazing thing to do. Like, yeah, you know, I can go through this set of Ter'angreal rings, and I can just see every possible future. But in the end, maybe maybe few people actually used these. You know, like, yeah, don't do that. Mm-hmm. That my aunt did that, and she's crazy. You know what I mean? Like, in the end,
she's like, tortured now.
she's tortured, and she can't move, and she can't leave her home because she's just afraid that the thing that she wants to happen won't happen if she does something wrong, or the thing that she doesn't want to happen will happen. You know what I mean? It's what the wise ones, I think, did go through. So I don't know that you can say even too much about this topic in the sense of, like, you could absolutely, like, write a paper about the dangers of future knowledge, you know, as explained by Robert Jordan. You know what I mean? You could go down this pathway. I still think it's totally overpowered when it comes to a talent standpoint, especially when you have a group of people like the wise ones who are collaboratively working together, right? Like, if you're just one person, maybe it's not that great. But if you got 4, 5, 10, whatever people, and you can compare notes, then it becomes really, really powerful, right? Then all of a sudden it's like, okay, yeah, I saw the same thing. You know, you know, when all of a sudden you can kind of spread that knowledge over multiple people and feel confidence in it, you can start making decisions, which clearly they do, right? They're clearly making decisions throughout, and maybe that's a fun way to kind of reread. You know, maybe that goes to anyone that's rereading the books right now is, you know, try to look at the decisions that they're making and ask yourself each time that they're making a choice, you know, how much dreamwalking was involved in, and how much note comparison was involved in that decision, and how nerve-wracking that must have, you know, if you go in world with this, how nerve-wracking that must be for them, because in the end, it was the survival of their people.
Maybe that's another major point in Warren's favor, that she carried the weight of her trip through the Rhiudean rings all by herself. She was the one who knew or assumed that her path was going toward the docks in Cain, you know? Like, what must that have done with her, to her mental state? And we see a little bit of that come through, because it's only after that she cedes some trust to Rand and some decision making to Rand, where she doesn't try to convince him to do things anymore, but rather more properly positions herself as an advisor instead of a controller.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, when she realizes she's not going to be around forever and he's going to have to stand up.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
I mean,
I wasn't going to say about that. You brought up something with Moraine, and it I can't remember what it was. Shoot, it was something you said there.
So much of Warren's life is driven by future knowledge, because her entire motivation was Guitar Amoroso's foretelling, right? Yeah. And then she finally, has her sort of apotheosis, her conclusion of that whole quest, when she finally finds Rand. And then she realizes, it's so much more than just that, because she also finds Matt and Perrin and Egwene and Nynaeve and Tom and Loyal, and she has to totally readjust her perspective on things. And being the kind of person she is, she's like, well, I need to realign everything into an orderly manner that I can control. And then over the next year and a half, she realizes, well, wait, no, I can't control this. And then she has this vision of the future that tells her, maybe not definitively, but probably, you're running out of time. You really need to change your paradigm.
That's an interesting point. The whole, her journey, right, was related to this very topic, and you think about that when she went to Rhiudean, right, she was still kind of full bore into, like, I know exactly where this is going. I'm gonna take the ball, and I'm gonna, whatever sport metaphor, I'm gonna run it into the end zone because I got this. It's all kind of coming together. And then she comes back from Rhiudean, and you're right, all of a sudden that additional future knowledge, it hits her, because it wasn't just a foretelling, right? It's one thing to tell somebody, like, yeah, this is going to happen, and another to see variation upon variation upon variation of futures, and you being able to kind of go, like, oh yeah, that's not going to work. I have to go down this one path, like that, to get the ball over the end zone. Yeah, go ahead.
To extend your metaphor there, she finds out in Rhiudean, she's on 4th down, and her play that she's drawn up only gets her like 5 yards.
Right. Yeah. She's not going to get there on her. Yes, exactly. She's not going to be the one to take it. Well, at least in that moment, right? He has to go on without her. And there definitely is a change there. And I guess I hadn't really taken that tact when it comes to kind of examining this. I was looking at more from a metaphysical standpoint, like, this is a crazy, what kind of power these individuals have, and more, you pull back from the reader's perspective, and a lot of this is about this kind of concept of future knowledge and free will, and and that mix between the two of, what do you do with it? What do you do when you have free will mixed with somewhat of an intrusive mechanism that's giving you lots of information? It becomes a very difficult proposition for everyone, right? Because the wheel has its own mission, right? The wheel has its own pattern, right? And it's pushing towards that outcome. What it,
and the wheel doesn't care.
Yeah,
the wheel doesn't care.
Yeah, it definitely has a specific kind of programming. So Chris, do you have a follow up on this kind of particular conversation?
Well, I was just gonna say that's just reacting to what you guys have just been saying. The story that Jordan wants to tell is the story of free will and people making choices in the midst of in the midst of these situations, and dealing with the end of the world and dealing with future knowledge and all of that. But I mean, that's the conclusion of the story, is that free will is necessary. And
yeah.
And that's, I don't know, Drew, maybe that's your writerly perspective. Yeah, I metaphysics, and I tend to think of it in world as if it's all real. But if you pull back a little bit to the story that and the, you know, what you're talking about how Moraine's character is shaped by this future knowledge. You know, she and Swan, thing mapped out. They had a plan, and you know, even at the beginning of the Shadow Rising, Moraine has a plan, and you know, Rand's going to go to Ilion, and they're going to go to the Hundred Thorn, and they'll be the people of the dragon. You know, she's got it all worked out, and based on she has, and you know, then she finds out that she's wrong about all that, and some of her future knowledge is that she was acting on is not correct. But this,
right, and like I won't go into it now. You know, maybe this is something to discuss at a later date. But each of our main characters has these sort of inciting themes. You know, where with Moiraine, it's her engagement with knowledge. It's her conflict with knowledge and what she's going to do. You know, with and in context of that knowledge. Whereas, you know, with Perrin, his conflict is with himself. You know, or with Rand, it's his conflict with destiny and things like that. So Robert Jordan really did a good job of setting up foundational conflicts that will build across multi-book, you know, of course, character arcs. Yeah. And Moiraine's, I think, is one of the most fascinating because of that, because it's such a nebulous idea of what to do with knowledge of the future. We have many, 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 you know, classic stories about, you know, man versus nature, man versus self, man versus God, whatever. And but we have very few, I feel like, that come down on the side of man versus knowledge, which is essentially what Moiraine is doing. You know, she has to grapple with the privilege she's been given of knowing events that, you know, that will come along, and she even talks about it a little bit in The Dragon Reborn. You know, she's clearly studied the prophecies, and that's yet another aspect of this future knowledge that she has, but she's still grappling with what those might mean. And into the early parts of the Shadow Rising, she's trying so hard to direct Rand in certain directions because she thinks she knows how to interpret the prophecies of the dragon. You know? She wants war with Ilion.
Yeah. Do you think that she failed that test? I mean, look at Ishmael, right? Ishmael, like he fails it, or does he understand it from the right viewpoint, which is the wheel, and like, this is a battle you're always going to lose, right? Which is, like, the wheel has all knowledge, right? The wheel has all knowledge, and your free will is really, in the end, subject to it, right? The wheel's not subject to you.
I don't know if I could ever say that Ishmael had it right, because I cannot, like, morally ascribe to utter nihilism the way he does.
Sure.
You know, this idea of, like, well, I can't control everything, thus oblivion is the goal. Like, no, but
I had to throw it out there. I'm not saying I buy into it.
Yeah,
but
yeah. But I do think he has maybe a deeper understanding of how the wheel weaves than Moiraine does. But I mean, that makes sense. You know, the guy was a hundreds-year-old philosopher in the Age of Legends during the peak of studies along these lines. Moiraine's like 40 years old and has never given this kind of philosophical thought to it. So I can't really blame Moiraine for acting as she does, but I will give her credit for adapting as she does.
Hey, by the way, to anyone that's watching still, I don't know if we've lost everyone going this deep into dreamwalking and such. Everyone's watching, so you might see the video might drop out for 5 seconds or so, but it'll be there. You'll still hear us keep on talking. The crew is just swapping something with the camera. So, but yeah, that's I guess to the question that you've kind of posed here is, I think that's a good one, which is in the end, this is man versus knowledge. It's really a compelling way to kind of think about the series. I like that, and it's a good way to read it, right? As we go back and reread these books, kind of taking a different tact in your reread, which is like, I want to look for these kind of things, these kind of themes, and I like that one a lot. I appreciate you throwing that one out there. I know sorry, go ahead, Chris.
It makes me think, Drew, what you've been saying about Moraine specifically makes me think about her return in A Memory of Light, and spoiler again, but
yeah, hopefully, yeah. We told everybody there was a couple spoiler warnings. Yeah.
Her goal at that point is to recite the prophecies and to give people that future knowledge. So, she turns up at Marilor, and people have all these objections and all these conflicts, and her answer to each of them, whether it's Egwene or Rand or whoever, is to quote the prophecies to them. And it's sort of,
it's interesting.
The embodiment, the person who speaks that future knowledge to them about what has to be. And, the other thing that we get from her constantly is that refrain, the will weaves as the will wills. So it's an interesting role that she has.
Sure. And in fact, this whole conversation here and my own sort of ruminations on Moiraine's character arc might have just like convinced me into being more of a Moiraine fanboy. Like, I was never a big Moiraine fan. Like, I was fine with her, but I never really understood why so many people loved her. And now I'm just like, whoa, wait a second. Maybe I'm not giving her enough credit here. Like,
good. I'm glad you've had a mind shift. That's always a fun experience, especially with these books, right? You kind of think you've maybe read and you've gotten enough themes out of them. So that's what I love about these. I love about having these kind of deeper discussions is they throw you into this place. Like I said, I'd never kind of gone down the road of Dreamwalking in the sense of man versus knowledge and thought about all the inherent dangers. Every time they brought up a danger in the book, I was like, whatever, that's just something that they kind of pass along and they tell people because
it's them being like, oh, if you have a nightmare that gets out of control or something.
Yeah.
But really the dangers strike much more to the core of your being and how you interact with the world and how you develop as a person.
Yeah. This, at least for me, this conversation has been extremely exciting and fun. I don't want us to go. I don't want to go too far down the road of having a 3 hour. Well, I do. I like these 3 hour conversation.
Well,
but I feel like this is probably a good place for us to kind of put a little end cap on this. And I do want to get your reaction to another piece of news that's out there. But first of all, I want to thank everyone that's been kind of hanging around, throwing comments up, and has actually listened through this. That's amazing. You had to have loved The Shadow Rising and
my gosh,
trying to take a trip down Dreamwalking and such with us. But again,
about in the flesh.
What did you say?
In the flesh.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the other piece of news that came out that I want to address before this is over is that Billy Zane is on, was recorded by I think it's the Fourth Tavern podcast. Justin from Credible Nerds. They run that podcast. I think it's Justin and Mark. And they went to FanX in Salt Lake City Comic Convention. And they asked Billy. Billy was there. I actually was there, and I thought about asking a question, but they actually did. They went up there, and I think another person after Justin, his name was Michael Smith, actually asked another question to him right along the same lines. But they asked, in essence, what was Billy's involvement, if any, currently. If you're not familiar with I can't remember, what's the Winters? I probably should have written that down. I can't remember the Winter Dragon. Yeah,
Winter Dragon.
Yeah. The little kind of mini prologue episode that came out. You guys can just look it up on the internet if you don't know about this, but
don't do it.
But Billy's recorded, talking about potential future in the series. Now we'll put the link down in the in the description after this. And if you haven't looked it up, just look up the Fourth Tavern podcast. You'll get the audio there. You can hear the question. We were going to play it during the show. It's a little bit difficult to hear, and we hadn't done any kind of post-production work to kind of make it, from an audio perspective, to listen to it. But did you both listen to that recording? Have you both heard it?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
No,
You haven't heard it yet, Chris. So, Drew, do you want to give us a summary of what we heard there, and then we can kind of start reacting? So, Chris, kind of catch Chris up on this.
Yeah. So, Billy Zane was asked about Winter Dragon, and he kind of explained the circumstances behind it, and then he expounded upon it, and basically said he is still involved with the show. And he has an option to step into season 2 and play a Shamael.
Yeah, that was really interesting because he actually alluded to the fact that that's when a Shamael shows up or something like that. And in the show itself, now all of us has to be taken with a grain of salt, right? Because he didn't. It sounded like he was kind of, we're just getting back into this. Like he didn't really have all the details necessarily in hand. Like that's how I took it from when I listened to it. But yeah, that was really interesting. Just that question itself. Let's take these one at a time. Just the idea that Ishamael might show up in the second season. I took that to mean more from a person perspective, not necessarily like the character himself would not be a part of that. That would be to me, that'd be a really strange adaptation without a first season touching on that Forsaken. But I also took it as he doesn't really know what he's talking about, and there's a tweet that we'll throw up here on the screen by chance regarding this question. It was Rafe Judkins, who's the showrunner. He actually was asked this during kind of one of these Watt Wednesday kind of questions, I believe. And they did ask if Billy Zane was going to be, had any part in it, I think. And
really?
His answer was resounding no. It was in capital letters when I say resounding. So, but you can, the exact, you can kind of, that's another one you can kind of Google if you're interested in wanting to see the exact question answer. But the impression was after he gave that answer was that Billy wasn't going to have a part in this. So I thought that was really interesting. Kind of, well, again, this is all kind of, I'm sure has to do with contracts and the way these relationships. I don't understand exactly how relationships between all of these groups came about, what the status is. It's not like we're going to pretend here like we know what's going on. But I guess it's possible, right? There's something out there that says, he might have an option to request it. I doubt it's an option.
Yeah.
I doubt it's an option where he can just force himself into it. That would really surprise me. But
right.
But maybe there's something where it's like he can request in, and then maybe they have to pay out. I don't know. It's one of those where you're like, what exactly is this? And I'm sure they'll put out a statement here. I'd be surprised if they don't, because it's an interesting piece of news to have out there. What were you saying, Chris?
I mean, let me throw this out there that because I was at Dragon Con this past weekend, and Billy Zane came up during one of the panels there, and several of the panelists who we all know from Jordan Con. We're talking about the fact Jennifer Liang, who runs Jordan Con, was talking about the fact that Billy Zane is apparently a huge Wheel of Time fan, and that supposedly the reason that he did Winter Dragon, which the existence of Winter Dragon, makes us all angsty. But the reason that he did it is because he wanted there to be a Wheel of Time TV show, and he is still a fan. And so the panel talked about, the idea that maybe fans should not hate on him as he is one of us, and talked about what possible role he might play. And several of them threw out the idea that he would make a good Ishamael. So that's all.
I'm just going to toss out, I would love it if he came back and reprised as Ishamael. I think he was great in Winter Dragon, and I know I'm in the minority here, and maybe we're going to get real controversial at the end of the episode here, but I didn't think Winter Dragon was that bad. There were a couple of things, there were some severe budget limitations and some really, really bad animations. but some of the writing was very creative. I loved the touch of like the dolls as the broken and dead children. And I loved Billy Zane specifically because he was such a comic book villain version of Ishamael. And, having just reread Eye of the World, that is exactly what Baalzamon is in that book. He's constantly like, oh, you slug under a rock, you know nothing. Like, he's so dramatic. Like, he's such a drama queen. I think it was an inspired performance. He was already laying the foreshadowing the seeds for people watching the show to put together that this guy in the prologue scene is the same as this fire-mouthed, fire-eyed dude who's ostensibly the Dark One later on. I don't know. I loved it.
Okay, so yeah, I don't want to going down that road of the episode. I think I had more problems with Luce Theron in that.
That guy was terrible.
The presentation. What he was, I don't know. Like in the end, I wanted. Well, again, it was just it wasn't like the biggest budget. It wasn't. There was a lot of things about it that. Where of course you say, with some more time and money and whatever, maybe it would have been better. But in the end of the day, I would say definitely from a perspective of who I preferred in those scenes, definitely Billy. I don't know that's the. I mean, to me, the Ishamael that we get later is going to be much different than that one, right? They're in much different places, mentally speaking, and physically speaking.
Actually,
so
I need to correct myself. I think what the panelists at Dragon Con actually said was that he would make a good Moradin rather than a good Ishamael.
Oh, okay. That makes more sense to me. Yeah, I wouldn't
pick
him.
Wait, you think he'd be a good Moradin over Ishamael?
I would totally pick him for a Moradin. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'd be the other way around. Moradin's got to be like a young, good-looking dude. And Billy Zane can pull off the comedically over the top, mustache twirlingly evil, oh.
I guess I hadn't gone down that road. I wasn't thinking from an age perspective. I was just thinking from a temperament perspective. That's more the Mord, and the temperament we get in the Eye of the World that isn't that, and not that it was meant to be, right? That's a prologue that's happening long before this, and like I said, they're two different people. But I wouldn't mind. I would much prefer just having new people in. I feel like there's too much kind of, blood there, if you will.
Yeah.
Old blood. But yeah, I would prefer that he. I don't know. I mean, then we'll find out what happened. But it was a really interesting kind of twist to the weekend to hear him make some comments about it. Chris, to your point of why he was involved, he mentioned in this audio. I'm not quoting him here, so please go listen to it. But it was he knew someone on the production staff, and I don't know, it sounded like he did it more as a favor. I don't know, but maybe it's because he is a fan of the books, and so this was like something somebody knows mentioned, and he was like, yeah, I want to jump in. But yeah, I think go look it up. Like I said, we'll have it in the description just right after the show here. Take a look. Yeah, really kind of weird moment of we get to watch the all this made, right, and all of the little dramas that show up in the public eye, and this is definitely one of them. Who knows if what he said is actually the case or not? But I'll be surprised if we don't hear something. I guess maybe silence will say a lot from Amazon Prime and all the groups related to it. But I'd be surprised if we don't. So definitely thought I had to bring that up to you guys. It's quite a little interesting wrinkle of this moment. But anyways, thanks to you both. For those of you that are still watching or you stuck around to listen to this whole thing, hopefully you'll check out Drew's podcast. It's a lot of fun. I have a lot of fun listening to it. You guys definitely get into the mix of it. You get it. It gets pretty heated, which is enjoyable, right? No one wants to just hear a full agreement, all the way around. So that I like, and I do like when you throw in a little mix of something that most people don't know, and then all of a sudden everyone in the panel goes, "Oh, shoot." Every once in a while you throw something in that I have to tweet about. I have to be like, no, that's totally wrong. That was land fear. I'm telling you. It's definitely land fear. With the
I've come around to that way of thinking after giving it more thought. But
yeah, no,
I'm not going to say I'm always right.
Look, we all have to retcon it. My entire web, I don't know how many times I've posted about the Wheel of Time, but I have to retcon at least 70% of it, I'm sure. But anyways, thanks to both of you for being here for this little special get together. Chris, thanks for throwing in your opinions. Really appreciate them. It was fun to kind of go to that deep dive in the metaphysics. And our next show, just so you know, this one's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to have our guest panelists in that were with us the first week, and we're going to be breaking down, adapting the Eye of the World scene by scene live. It's going to be a lot of fun because I imagine there's going to be a lot of disagreement. What should stay? What should go? If you had to cut somebody, would you cut them out? Can you cut them out? Or do you just kind of want to merge them into something else? Or do you want to add a scene? I think there's going to be a lot of scenes that we did not see in the books. I think that's going to happen. Be very surprised if it doesn't. And, but that's going to be that discussion. We're just going to get on live, and we're going to start at the beginning, and we're going to say, okay, Rand and Tam are walking down the road, this quarry road. What is that relevant? Do we need this first introduction to the village? Do we have to have it? Can we just start at a different place? What is it that we need to keep? What can we get rid of? What can we streamline and adapt? So that's gonna be a lot of fun. That's Wednesday. That'll be right around 8:30, 9 p.m. Eastern on Wednesday. Come join us. Give us your opinions. We'd love to hear you in the comments, and we want to hear you live. Call in. Tell us we're wrong. Tell us we're right. We look forward to hearing from you. Thanks again to you both, and we'll see you guys on Wednesday. Good night.
Thanks, Matt.